happy Monday and a start to a new week, new opportunities. And if you are here, that means you registered for a amazing conversation brought to you by TPE around negotiation. Before we go into this amazing topic and before I introduce our amazing presenter, what I want to do is just talk about some ground rules. And so this session is recorded. And so for all the information that we are going to present here, it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel and we will send it out in a future newsletter. Additionally, for those who are in this session, just in case, you can always, if you don't want to showcase who your name is or your video, turn off your camera, turn off your name. And that way, if you don't want your employer to know that you're in this space, that's one way to resolve the issue. Secondly, you'll realize there is a chat feature. If you have any questions at any point in time, feel free to write them in the chat. We'll do our best. And when I mean our best, we will do it regardless. We will answer the questions as well as make sure we share it with our presenter today. And with that, Nick, anything I left out with ground rules?
Nothing at all.
Perfect. So here we are. It's May. This is our second session, and this is our last session for May, and we're talking about negotiation. Our last session, we talked about the on-campus experience, right? So when you're on campus, how do you navigate that space? How do you feel empowered? How do you market yourself to make sure you get the job? And now we're going to talk about, okay, you got the job, but how do you make sure that you are negotiating it properly? And when we mean negotiation is when you are received your salary, when you received your benefits, to analyze that and look at that holistically. And we would not be able to do this amazing session without our director of TPE currently, Dr. Kirsten Fox. And so I'll pass the mic to you, Kirsten, and we'll be here monitoring the chat.
Great. Well, thank you, Christian and Nick, and hello to everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you might be. And I know some of you might be watching this after the fact. The good news is I hope you are joining us today because that means you're close to getting a job offer. And if you're not quite close, you will eventually get a job offer. And so it is still good to just think through the negotiation process. And we're going to spend a little bit of time. I'm going to talk with you about a few different kind of steps, things to think about, things to consider. But I also want to make sure that I get to your questions. As Nick and Christian said, I currently serve as the director of the Placement Exchange. I have a background of working in career development with both employers and job seekers and candidates, and have served in this role working with both our universities and hiring institutions, as well as our TPE candidates. But I also am probably the most seasoned on the call. And what that really means is I'm the oldest and have had the most jobs, which also means I have probably been in a place to negotiate the most. And what I can also start by saying is it is never an easy process. It can feel uncomfortable, and that's okay, right? And we're going to talk through that. I was really fortunate, and in the second job I was ever offered, I had a boss who said to me at the time, because I basically accepted on the spot, she said, "Don't you want to negotiate at all?" And one, I was glad that I got the chance to negotiate, but two, if there was room for negotiation, there was also part of me that thought, well, why didn't you just offer me the higher salary to begin with? Like, why even put us through that, right? So unfortunately, we can't think about too much as to why an offer is made the way it is and whether there's room for negotiation or not, but we can at least control kind of how we respond or the types of questions we ask and how we advocate for ourselves. So I want to make sure that we're spending time today doing that. And when I think about the goals, right, the most important part is to make sure you know your value, right? Because you are worthy of getting what you hope to get, right? Now, we have to be realistic. You know, I might think I am worthy of getting $500,000, but nobody is ever going to pay me $500,000, right? So there are realistic expectations, and we're going to talk about that as well. But you know your value better than anybody else knows your value, right? You know your experience, your qualifications better than anybody else. They've seen your resume, you've been through the interview process, they have offered you the job if you're at the point of negotiation. And we'll talk a little bit about some kind of job offer negotiation as well, right? But in the meantime, they've offered you a job, so they want you on their team. So be your authentic self, right? Like, you also know what you need to make the job work, and you know what is not going to work for you. But as I mentioned, you have to have realistic expectations. And the best way to do that is to be prepared. And if anybody has ever come to any other kind of talk or conversation that I have had about the job search process, one of the things that I will say over and over and over again is being prepared, right? You have to be prepared for the school for which you're applying for a job by knowing enough about them to showcase why you'd be a good, add value to that campus, right? You have to be prepared when you come and interview. And I always recommend practicing with a friend or with somebody else before you show up for an interview. So the negotiation process is similar, right? You want to be prepared. And to do that, you want to kind of do your homework. So benchmarking salary and benefits, and then also knowing your strategy. Because if you're able to think through your strategy, you're more likely to kind of go with it, right? Because it can be really awkward to talk about money, especially with a potential boss, right? And so you might want to do it, but then in the heat of the moment, you're like, oh, great, that sounds great. And then you get off the phone, and you're like, well, that stings. Now it's too late. So you want to come in with a strategy and stick with it. And so again, you kind of want to practice that and then articulate your value. So to set the stage a little bit, and this is where, I'm going to bring in some data. Now, recognize that this is gendered and not everything is gendered. And so I want to acknowledge kind of the error of some of this data. But I think what is important to think about is populations that are traditionally underserved, right? This is not a surprise to any of us, earn less than particularly white men, right? So both in gender as well as race and ethnicity. And so I put this up because I think it's really important to keep that in mind as well, that there is a gap by gender, there's a gap by race, there is gaps by gender and race that are even more staggering. And so I say this to also know, kind of as a way to sort of like maybe motivate yourself a little bit as well. Hopefully the employer is looking out for you. But again, you have to also advocate for yourself when it comes to salary, right? And so I put this out not to make people feel depressed, but to also, it's unfortunate. I also put this out because eventually you're going to continue to move up in your career. And when you become a hiring manager, this is something that I know I have brought with me when I have advocated for hiring others, that I am trying to do my best to eliminate any kind of pay gaps that exist, right? So eventually we're going to move into other roles in our career where we can possibly be the decision maker. So I just put this out there because I think it's important for everyone to know. So that being said, regardless of gender, or regardless of race and ethnicity, a couple of things to keep in mind. Your starting salary at whatever your next job is, or your next salary, will impact your ability to grow your salary over time. So this is one reason why it is so important to negotiate on the front end, right? And we're gonna, I have 2 children, I'm helping them with kind of math and percentages. So I'm gonna take it back to sort of, primary school math, right? But if we think about kind of just traditional growth, so if you make a base amount, and on average, at least of gender, starting salaries can have a difference of about $4,000, right? So a salary of $4,000 by year 2, the difference is all of a sudden $4,300 difference, right? So it continues to grow. And that's because your salary increases are usually percentages, right? So for those of you going into your second job or have been in jobs before, you might get a cost of living increase or a merit increase, or your retirement benefits. So like if your employer contributes 5% of your salary to retirement, or 10% of your salary to retirement, right? 10% of 40,000 is obviously more than 10% of 36,000. So each year, the retirement grows and grows and grows disproportionately, right? Similarly to your basic annual increases, if it's cost of living or merit. and maybe it's around, right? Not every year do you get merit. Unfortunately, not every year do you get cost of living, especially in global pandemics and some other, times of recession. But on a good year, most institutions will give a cost of living increase and ideally even maybe a merit increase, right? But if you get a grand total of a 3% increase, 3% on 50,000, again, is a lot more than 3% on 45,000. Or 3% on 40,000 is more than 3% on 36,000. So then, right, for easy math, I'm going to use 100,000, even though lots of us will not make that. But right, 3% of 100,000, all of a sudden you get, 3,000 more dollars, right? Where 3% of 90,000, you don't get that. And so then all of a sudden you're making 103,000 as opposed to 91,000. So then you get, right, you see where this gap is going. So I just want to make sure, right, I put that out there at the front to also just remind you and help give the confidence on the importance of getting more money at the beginning. At the same time, eventually you're going to move jobs. And so that does provide an opportunity to get an increase. And the goal is usually to match or more so increase your salary, right? Oftentimes state institutions publish salaries. It's usually public information. And so people can find salaries. So the hard part is if you're locked into a salary and you're trying to negotiate more, sometimes they might be able to know what you're currently making. And while that's not great and not ideal, and we could even say it might not be fair, there could be employers that are doing that, right? Especially if you're within a state system or switching jobs from one job on a campus to another, right? That starting salary is still there. And so it's harder to even move jobs outside at as much of an increase. So again, just kind of putting that out there to kind of, like I said, give you that confidence. So that being said, congrats, you've got the job. Now it's time to negotiate the salary. And we're going to talk about a whole bunch of aspects that come into that negotiation. But I wanted to pause here, and hopefully I haven't frightened everybody, just to look at the chat to see if there are any questions that have come up in the chat so far, or if anybody wants to write in, like, what about negotiating the salary for a position makes you the most nervous? Or if you want to unmute yourself and chime in, or if you want to write in the chat. Anyone?
I have a question. I guess what makes me the most nervous is the rejection, right? So
Yep.
Even though no one has asked me to negotiate, and I know that I can negotiate, or going in, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, right? So going in there and negotiating is important. And so I guess where I get nervous is if they haven't asked, am I a bad person for saying, hey, like, can we revisit salary or other benefits?
Yep. That's a great question, Christian. And I see some in the chats as well. So I think, and that's exactly it, right? It's not knowing how to ask, how much is too much, how far you can go, how much you can ask for, what is even the starting point, how do you find those comparables, right? They might respond with the salary is non-negotiable. All really good points. Nick put in fear of retaliation at work because you asked for more. And that definitely makes sense as well, right? Or simply feeling like you should be grateful for whatever you're offered, especially during a pandemic when there's not as many jobs. Maybe you're thinking, gosh, I'm just lucky I got this job. I don't want to ask for more. Then I feel like I'm being greedy or something else. So all great questions and all things that we're going to address, but kind of two points to remember. One, they offered you the job because they want you in the role, right? So they already want you in the position. So I don't think you have to fear retaliation. Oftentimes, it's not even up to the hiring manager. The hiring manager might want to give you more, but it's set because it's a pay scale or a pay rate based by HR or somebody else at the institution, right? Two, oftentimes the person you ask isn't even going, right? You can't get something that you don't even ask for, right? So Christian, you mentioned that as well. So If you ask for more, the worst that can happen is they say no, right? But the best that can happen is you get a little bit more, whether it's what you asked for or something in between. And we're going to talk about those strategies, right? But best case scenario, you get a little bit more. Worst case scenario, you don't get any more because either it's non-negotiable or they just say flat out say no. But either way, they want you in the position. You definitely should negotiate. And the worst that can happen is they say no. They're not going to retaliate against you because they want you in the job, right? They are also looking out for your best interest as a hiring manager. They wouldn't offer you the position if they didn't want you on their team. So that should hopefully give you a little bit more confidence. Also, very few people will ever know that you ever asked for more money, right? You will negotiate with the person that makes you the offer, and they're potentially going to take it back to their supervisor or a hiring person within the HR unit, and then they're going to let you know. None of your colleagues, nobody else in the office are even going to know. And most likely by the time you start, it is such a long memory that they're not even going to remember, right? So try to kind of get that part out of your nerves. There's some good questions also about being able to find where you even see some salaries and compensation. So that's great. We're going to get to that as well. So that being said, let me go back to my slides. All right. So a couple of things I already mentioned, know your value. They're already interested in you. Feel comfortable talking about your accomplishments. So when you remember back to when you first applied and they list kind of required qualifications and preferred qualifications, right? Come into that and think about, where did you have the preferred? Where do you have more than what was required, right? Use that to your advantage. Be confident in those skills. Again, there's a difference between being confident in yourself and being conceited, like, well, you need me because I could do this, this, or this. Because right now we know there are a lot of really great job seekers that are having trouble finding jobs. So yes, in that sense, there could be somebody else out there, but be confident. They want you to come to their organization or their office or this position. They want you to be successful. They don't want to have to do a search again. So you have the upper hand in that sense. So think through your resume, your cover letter, and again, those aspects of the job description where you're aligned and where you might be able to offer more than what they asked, and bring that to the bargaining table, for example, okay? And we'll talk more specifics about actual kind of amounts and how to think about dollars. But again, that at least provides you a place to start. So for example, I might say, you know what? And this is once you kind of get the offer, right? If they give you an amount, then that's where you can come back and say, you know what? I appreciate the offer. I was thinking, here's a few other things that I can bring to the position. For example, I've already supervised an entire staff. I have a little bit more experience than the minimum requirements. I can do some really great data analysis, whatever it might be, and I think I would like to be compensated more, and then you give them an amount. Again, the worst that can happen is they say no. So as you think about knowing your own value, right? This is partially about knowing your brand, right? I put down just at the bottom, I always love kind of these pictures. These are all things that we know. You don't even have to know anything about them, but you just look at a picture with no words and you know exactly who this is, right? So, and Nick and Christian and previous candidate development have talked about kind of building your own professional brand. So I encourage you to go back and look at some of those. But know that brand, feel comfortable talking about your accomplishments. Again, they're interested in you. This is sort of redundant, but I think it's important to just know that. And then when you're doing your research, and somebody referenced Glassdoor, which is a good opportunity, right? But think about what are comparable positions, comparable experiences, comparable places, and then your market value. So Glassdoor is a good place to look. They don't always share everything. Another great place to look is, again, most state schools, you're an employee of the state, right? So like I technically work for a state institution in Ohio. And so I am on the state of Ohio treasurer's website with my salary. I used to work for a state institution in Maryland. I was on a public salary report every year that the university would put out, actually in the school newspaper. So most state institutions, you can find some salary data for most types of positions. If you're looking at a private school, look at state institutions in the same geographic region, right? Because at the same time, a public institution or a school in Ohio, the cost of living is very different than the cost of living in San Francisco, right? Or Nick lives in Boston and Christian lives in DC. Two very expensive places to live compared to Ohio. So salaries are probably not going to be equivalent. Or if they are, then you can keep that in mind when you're doing your own kind of weighing the benefits of a specific position. So you want to look at comparable positions and comparable experiences. My very first job out of grad school, I was at a private institution and I was an assistant director, even though I had never had full-time work experience. I was there for a few years. I then moved to a much larger school where I had more responsibilities, but was a program coordinator, right? So my title went down, but my responsibilities actually went up and my experience went up. So you also can't just search by title, because in higher ed, a lot of titles don't always equate with the job. So if you look up another position at a state institution, or if there is another job posting that does showcase their salary, if yours doesn't, that is where you can try to find some comparable experiences. Again, you want to look by location. You know, is it urban? Is it rural? East Coast, Midwest, West Coast, those types of things. And then know your own market value, right? Do you have, is it master's preferred or master's required? Is it 2 years post-master's preferred? And do you have it, right? Those types of things. Again, what are your experiences that come into that? So as you're doing all of that, right, I'm just kind of putting this in, you do want to try to find the salary range from the employer. One of my biggest pet peeves, and I'm sure for most of you on this call, is that very few jobs post the salary range. Or if they do, it's like, oh, the salary range is $25,000 to $70,000. Well, that's not helpful either, right? So you want to try to find the range. It is okay to ask the employer, okay? Again, it is okay to ask the employer or the search committee, or pick up the phone and you can call HR and say you're a candidate for X position and you're trying to find out the salary range. Again, the worst they can do is not give you the information, but hopefully they do. Now, I would say you might not want to ask before you even apply. Well, you could actually ask before you apply. That might be an okay time because you haven't submitted your materials yet. You know, otherwise, you might want to wait till you're a little bit in the process, because that is where some people might be completely okay with it. If somebody asked me, I'd be completely okay with it. But I'm also I would prefer to share that information. Now, some schools don't let employers share it. So no, it's also not always up to the employer, right? It could be somebody in the HR department might not let them. But again, some employers are completely comfortable if you ask that. Some might not be. But at the same time, you might then kind of weigh, well, if they're not even comfortable telling you that and they'd be their direct supervisor, would you want to work for them anyway? And hopefully if they are not willing to tell you because they're not allowed, they would say, I'd love to be able to give you that information, but I can't share that. I once worked for a private school where I never even knew the salary of the people I supervised, and I supervised 7 people, right? It was at the HR level and the chief financial officer level. And when I made the offer, and then literally somebody from the HR department picked up the phone, called them, and gave them the salary range, I was completely excluded from the process, even as a director of a unit. So no, each school does happen a little bit differently. But eventually you should be able to find out the salary range. The commensurate with experience, which is often posted, is also a real thing, okay? I have been a hiring manager, or maybe I've had a little bit of a range, because, you know, I really was, it depended on what the final candidate brought. And I once made an offer on somebody that was probably overqualified for the position, but when push came to shove, they were really interested. They were interested in making a transition. But then I realized, you know what, they have supervisory experience. I may actually take one of the or two of the people I supervise and put them in their portfolio and give them some extra responsibilities. right? So as a result, I might have paid them at the top end of the range. And I know that could be really frustrating, but I didn't necessarily know who my candidate pool would be when it happened. And so there are employers that are going to have that range, and it can be frustrating, but we also want to give them the grace to have that depending on what the pool might offer, right? But again, there was always a range. So ideally, you find out the range by either looking at other schools. If you know somebody else at the institution, you can always try to reach out to them and say, hey, I'm applying for this job, or I'm a candidate, I've been offered an interview. Do you have any idea kind of what you think the range might be? And oftentimes they do, even if they're in a different unit, they have an idea of what an assistant director or program coordinator or an entry level or a person with 5 years experience might make. So kind of do your research through different ways to try to find that range. I would also say it is okay before you accept a final interview, especially if it's one where they are asking you right now to travel, to say, I'm not even sure that I need to know the salary range before I can commit to this interview process. And that's okay as well, right? Okay, so now we've got the range, kind of some tips as to how to do that. Then you want to think about, okay, what is the midpoint of the range? And then what is your target salary, right? So let's say they say the range is $32,000 to $48,000. So it's this, $16,000 range. Okay, what's the midpoint? And then maybe add 10% to that as maybe your target salary, right? Or if you're like, what I'd really like to make, if the range is 32 to 48, I think I deserve all 48, then you could add the 10% to that. But if they've given a range, they're probably not going to go over that. So again, that's why we kind of say, what is the midpoint? And then add 10%. But again, this is where compared to the job description, where you have the qualifications and where you can go above and beyond the qualifications, right? At the same time, you need to sort of set, what would your take-home pay be, right? So each state has different tax levels. Think about your just taxes in general. And then you also want to create a realistic budget, right? We know that as higher ed and student affairs pros, we might have to spend more on some expenses than others. But technically, kind of the ideal is 50% for take home for your absolute necessities, right? Housing, transportation, food, utilities. 20% goes towards like retirement, loans, even credit card debt. And then the other 30% is kind of spending, savings, investments, that kind of thing. Now, I've never been 50, 20, 30. I'm probably more in that extra is more in the 20%, right? Because we chose this field. But that's kind of an ideal sort of way to think about your budget when you think about a salary. Okay, that tends to just be kind of a good way, right? So when you think about your take home after taxes, right, then from that take home is where you want to think about what's going to go towards all of your bills: housing, phone, car, cable, Netflix, computer, whatever else. What's going to go towards retirement and loans, and what might go towards kind of just spending, fun, savings on the side. And then you want to determine your resistance point. You should not take a job where you're going to completely go into debt, right? I would like to say you shouldn't take a job where you have to have a side hustle, but this is again student affairs. I've been one of those people that has had a job and a side hustle, right, for much of my career. But you still want to determine your resistance point. Okay, so like if you know that this is going to be a really bad financial decision to move to X city where you also have to pay moving expenses, no one, the housing's expensive, it doesn't come with, an on-campus apartment, and you just can't make it work and be able to pay off loans, then know that, right? And then again, assess the value of other benefits as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. Healthcare, flexible schedule, tuition remission, vacation and sick leave, professional development. And this might change from time to time, depending on where you are in your career. When I was in my 20s, I lived in a major metropolitan area, and I didn't really need vacation time, and I didn't really need a flexible schedule. And I invested in healthcare, but it wasn't as important to me. And so for me, like salary was more because I was in an expensive city where I needed to have an apartment and live. Now I'm at a different stage of my life where vacation days and retirement are much more expensive, right? I have children. I want to take time off to be with them. I want to have that flexible schedule. I want to look towards my retirement, right? Those are maybe actually more important to me right now than my monthly take-home salary. So that might vary. Eventually my kids are going to go to college, right? At that point, I might want to look more at what kind of institutions offer tuition remission. And is that a benefit I want to take advantage of? Right now, it's not something, that is that high on my priority list, but 5 years from now, it is going to be high on my priority list, right? So again, think about all of the other benefits as well, especially now that we have lived through a global pandemic or living through it. It's not over yet. But think about, is an employer open for flexible schedules or not? And now that maybe you've worked from home, is it something you enjoy or something where you're like, I really prefer to be around people all the time and in an office, right? Do you want a job that comes with on-campus housing? Does that matter? Does it come with a meal plan? If so, are you going to take advantage of it, right? I've known a lot of housing professionals that get a meal plan and don't take advantage of it, right? That might be wasted cash, but those are costs that you want to think about as well when you think about all of your different benefits. So then with knowing, right, negotiation, it's again, knowing your strategy. And so we're just going to kind of reiterate and talk a little bit more about things I mentioned. But again, establish your target salary. So think about the midpoint. So at this point of your life, think about what classmates are earning. You can always ask people if they don't want to tell you, right? It's some people believe you should never talk about money, but you don't know until you ask. So again, the worst someone can do is say, I don't feel comfortable telling you that. But go ahead and ask, right? Ask on a student affairs Facebook group, ask colleagues, ask mentors, connect with people on LinkedIn, find other ways to kind of reach out. And you can always ask them, what do you think is a ideal salary for someone in my position with my experience in X city? Right? Maybe you're talking to somebody, you have a job offer in Boston. And so you reach out to Nick because you heard me say that Nick lives in Boston, right? And he might be a good resource, even if you're at a different school, for example. Again, you could ask, right, other people what that is. Then think about what your amount is, then add 10%, right? So if you want $50,000, add 10% to that before you ask, right? So then you're asking for, right, 55,000. Again, the worst they can do is say no, but add that buffer of 10% because most likely they're going to come back and not offer you all that you ask for. So that's why I always suggest adding 10% to what you really want, right? Again, calculate your take-home pay and then create that realistic budget. Again, think about everything else besides salary as part of the negotiation process too. And they might come back and say, we can't negotiate on salary at all. Like it is what it is. We're a state institution or we're a private institution, but we're not allowed to give, like, I can't give you any more. Then you might want to think about, okay, well, can I have, an extra $1,000 for professional development? It's really important for me to go to these 2 conferences. Or how do you help pay for tuition? Or is this something we can work out if you don't have tuition remission? Or maybe it's, I already have a week of vacation scheduled for this year. I realize I will have not earned it yet. I'd rather not take unpaid leave for it. Could I have that week of vacation off still, right? That's something I've done in the past successfully. And that adds up too, right? That's basically a week of pay that I got without having to take any leave. So if you put that in money terms, that's still a good chunk of change that technically, even if I didn't see it on my paycheck, I didn't have to use it. And so that is still a financial benefit, right? Propose your own flexible work schedule, right? They might not offer it to you, but before you accept it, you could say, I'd really like to work from home 1 day a week or 2 days a week. Again, the worst they can say is no, but they might say, oh, sure, we'll do that. And then you're saving maybe on parking or on gas or some other, eating out, because you can quickly just go down and raid your pantry. So think about that as well. And I would say, think about the office culture as well. And we've talked about this in previous sessions, but I have had jobs where I've made more money and worked in positions that were not so great for my own mental well-being, right? Maybe it was my supervisor, maybe it was colleagues, maybe it was just the overall environment. And that's really difficult. And then I've had jobs that maybe didn't pay me as much as I wanted, but I had a really great environment. I had mentorship. I had colleagues who turned into friends. I was given professional development opportunities. I grew. They looked out for my best interest. And those might be things that I can't put a value on financially, but then helped me grow as a professional, which then potentially helped me down the road, right? So think about all of those aspects as well. So with that, I want to be cognizant of time, and think about, what to do now and kind of a to-do list. And I'm just looking quickly back on the chat to see if there's some questions. And I have just a couple other things I want to make sure I talk about. Yeah. So somebody made the point of always unsure what to put when they ask your desired salary within the job application, and they make it a mandatory field. I was just talking about this earlier today. So more and more universities are having centralized HR systems where they ask that question, you put it in. The HR system rarely, they might, if they post a range, if it is way outside the range, they are not necessarily, they may discard your application. So schools that ask that typically also have a range somewhere, but this is, again, we're trying to find out a desired salary is okay. And so that's sort of where, again, I would try to find the range that you believe is good for you. And that I would bring in that cost of living and then add 10% and then put that in. Very few hiring managers actually then end up seeing those numbers by the time you get across their desk with your resume and cover letter, right? Like that's the kind of HR system. So just know that you will want to do that research again, find that range, find what you would want within the range, add 10%, and then put down that number. Another question, right? The range is tricky. Right, and so that's why some schools have very small pay scales, some have really big. I know a large state institution, it's like it could be a pay range 13, B1, 2, which means very little. But that's where trying to use LinkedIn or reach out to connections to figure out, okay, what does this actually mean? But ideally, the hiring manager would let you know, but somebody in HR would be able to say, here's what that range means and give you that amount. What if they list the salary range, not expected to exceed, and it lists the lowest number in the range? Right, and that could happen too, right? But that could also be because there are some benefits that come with in a classification. So know that as well, right? Different institutions, you may receive different benefits if you're classified in a certain range. And that could be vacation days, it could be eligible for promotion. And so a manager might kind of advocate to move you up into a certain range, but you still have to be the lowest dollar amount in that range. But because it gives you extra kind of credibility on campus by being in that higher range, even if you don't see that come through in the remuneration, right, in the salary. So that is often sometimes a compromise that maybe a hiring manager will do with HR or with the finance office. For good kind of points and questions. Could you negotiate something like a flexible work schedule after you've already accepted the offer and are in the process of getting ready to start in a few weeks? Great question. So you could. They have less, I think it could be harder for them to work with you or say yes. Again, the worst they can do is say no. They still want you. They've already offered you the job. You're already in the process. They aren't going to, remove the offer, right? But I would say it becomes a bargaining piece when they've offered you the position to ask on the front end. It gives them a little bit less, it gives them right, less room to be resistant if they're worried that they might lose you as a candidate, because they want you, right? They've given you the offer and they don't want to lose you. So if you can ask them beforehand, better, but again, it never hurts. I have renegotiated different things at different points of time once I've started. Salary is the hardest thing to ever renegotiate, right? Because once you're in, you're kind of locked in with just typical increases. And usually they can only give you a bigger raise if you actually are assuming a new title or new responsibilities. So that flexible work schedule could be something that's more easily negotiated after the fact. Okay, so if they list a range, they may have only budgeted for, right, they may have only budgeted for the lowest amount in the range and cannot go higher. That is also true. And hopefully they'll just be honest and open with you that is the case. Okay, so you now have the job, kind of what you want to do. So again, this is where the more prepared you are, the easier, right? Because I don't know many people that love negotiating for more money, right? In our heads, of course, we all want more money or we want better benefits, but it's really hard to do when you're on the phone or on Zoom talking with your supervisor. So just a few suggestions, right? Have your notes in front of you, highlight your resume and their job post so you can see again those qualifications and the value that you have, right? Prioritize a list of what you want to negotiate for. And again, what your resistance points are. So like have a resistance point with salary, right? Like what is just not acceptable for you to be able to take the job? And that's again, where you kind of want to think about your budget and all of your expenses, right? Think about professional development stipends, flexible work schedule, all of those aspects and where those fit in your priority at this point of your job, right? Also know that this is a moment of time and a job that you're only probably going to be in for a few years, right? You're going to be in a lot of jobs, especially if you're an early level professional. So this is not going to be the job that you're in forever. The easiest thing to renegotiate in future jobs are professional development, work schedules, vacation, those types of things. The hardest thing is going to be salary because you're sort of in at whatever your base salary is, especially if you're within a state system or trying to move jobs within the same institution. And then kind of the other step is, right, just try to be confident, practice, know your value. I would also say, and this is one that kind of goes back and forth a little bit, right? Get the offer in writing before you accept officially. So this is something I would always say in the past. It's a little bit harder now just because oftentimes they won't write it down until you've accepted it. And so that negotiation might happen beforehand, but at least ask for an email or something where there is something kind of in writing first. Your official offer letter may not be able to come until you have unofficially accepted. So that is something that is a growing trend. But besides just a phone call, it's okay to ask for something in writing, even if it can't be the official offer that lists kind of your benefits, your salary, those types of things. All right, so that being said, I want to make sure we reserve the rest of the time because you've got some great questions coming in. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can actually see you and see the questions. I know I probably skipped a few. If they've agreed to raising your salary, would you recommend still asking for moving expenses, meal plan, parking passes? Yeah, so I mean, I think this is where you ask about that kind of in the beginning. So when they offer you the total compensation package, right, it's okay to first take time to think about it. Sometimes it's easier, and you can also email questions back and forth. You can always email back questions in the meantime and say, you know, I'm really interested. You know, I'd like to talk more on Wednesday at 10 a.m. That's where you might come with your ask of the amount. But in the email say, but in the meantime, could you let me know, do you provide any money for moving expenses? Is there a meal plan? Tell me what parking is like on campus. The more you put out there up front, the more they're going to try to help you right away. I've been in, you know, I'll think back to 2 jobs ago as a supervisor. If I got asked those questions, I would have said, well, we typically don't do moving expenses, but let me see what I can do. We can maybe reimburse you for up to X amount. I might say, meal plans is usually, it either comes with the position or it doesn't, but there could be room, especially on smaller private schools, to have that be a little bit more flexible. Or they might say, well, it doesn't come with a meal plan, but we'll give you a campus ID preloaded with X number of dining dollars on it. Parking passes are usually harder to negotiate because either it's a campus where you pay for it or it's a campus where you don't. But you want to know that cost, right? So like that is something where they might say, oh no. And then you find out, gosh, this is expensive. It's $100 a month just to park. That's an additional $1,200 for the year. I'm coming from a job or a place where that's not an expense. Would there be a way to add that part on to my salary? Right. So you can always ask those questions. Are moving expenses only reserved for very high level professionals and higher? Not necessarily. It really depends on the school. That's one of those that's really easy. You can ask for it. They'll either say yes or they'll say no, or they might say, oh, let me see what I can do. Right. But again, it never hurts. It never hurts to ask. I've worked for schools that have had them early in my career, and I've worked for schools later in my career that haven't offered them. So it just really depends. Yep, good. It looks like you guys have been answering each other's questions, so perfect. All right. Great. Nick, thanks and Christian, thanks for answering questions as well. All right, what other questions? And I might have missed some, but I know we have about 10 minutes left.
Kirsten, I was wondering if you could talk about, other things to ask for instead of a focus on salary. We kind of had a pre-conversation about this prior to the start of this.
Yeah, so think about, I can tell you, right, this is where prioritizing your list of what's important to you. And so, thinking about, do you even, what is their starting date? And do you want to maybe delay your starting date? That could be something that you could ask for. Maybe you're like, I just need to have 2 weeks to decompress. If they have said, we really want you to start June 1st, and you're like, I really don't want to start till June 15th, ask them. There aren't, most likely, unless there's a training or a conference or something that you cannot miss, and that is very possible, right? Especially in housing where there's summer training or orientation happens, that might not be something where they can budge, but there's a good chance they can. And even if it's not ideal, they're like, well, it's only 2 more weeks, right? Like, we'll let you start a little bit later. Professional development is a great one to ask for. Somebody, oh, I just see that a question came through. What's a reasonable amount to ask for? I think that's where, instead of just asking for an amount, I would say, think about, where do you have professional association memberships currently, or where might you want to continue to be involved or get involved if you aren't, and look up how much does it cost to join that association. And are there a couple of conferences that you could, that you'd want to attend, and then kind of come up with a budget, and so whether it's, $1,000, $1,500, whatever kind of works for you. And they might say, oh yeah, for us, if you present at a conference, we pay for you to automatically go, but you have to be a presenter, right? A lot of schools will do that. So you can also ask them what that is, right? Nick referenced technology, completely agree. I have negotiated for Apple products in the past as well, successfully. And I was in an office I worked in, the only Apple user, but it was something that I was very familiar with. There was Apple support on campus. So if I had a problem, the IT office could still help and provide support for that. I have also negotiated for an extra monitor, or something else to maybe take home, a printer at home because I was doing work. Obviously, it's the schools, so at the point where my employment would end, I would return that, just like everything else. But do what feels comfortable for you. If you are better working in one platform than another, you can do that. Some schools automatically give you money towards transportation, parking, cell phone reimbursement. You know, I would hope that if you're a housing professional and you're on call and you're expected to use your cell phone, that's automatically built in. But maybe even as a student activities professional, that's not something that they've thought about in the past. But now that we've gone virtual and you're needing to be by your phone more frequently, it might be helpful, especially if you're working a lot of evenings and walking around a building, or need to be kind of, you know, just able to be connected. You know, you can ask for things like cell phone bill, you know, payment or reimbursement. You know, and I think that's where it's helpful to think through again, like what might you need to do your job successfully, right? And then, you know, again, vacation time, maybe it's paid time off that you can ask for, or even if it's unpaid time off, just being able to take that flexibility. Sometimes there's jobs where they say you're not allowed to use any vacation in the first 90 days. And you're like, oh, wait a minute, I'm supposed to go to a family reunion, or, ooh, I already have something, I already have a trip planned, right? Negotiate those things. The more you can do that on the front end, the better. I have also in the past negotiated childcare costs, right? I have children, and I moved from a campus that had on-campus childcare to a campus that did not. And so that became a new cost that I had to incur at a much higher rate. And so they did a little bit of childcare reimbursement, right? Kind of pre-tax, which was great. And so that was sort of one of those. Again, there's probably a lot of things you can negotiate. You just want to sort of prioritize what's most important for you at this stage. Again, especially beyond salary. I think we so often look at just salary as the bottom line. And that's where I would say, think about all the other expenses you have as well, and what's most important to you at this stage of your life, to think through what else would make your job kind of worth doing. That being said, I see a question. Does it look bad to turn down a job offer specifically due to salary? Does it look as if you haven't done your research on how much the position should pay? No, I mean, here's what I would say. I would say I've turned down a job once based on salary. I think I also realized based on the salary, it just wasn't the job I wanted, maybe responsibility wise also, but that was absolutely part of it. Now, I was very clear with them before I came to the on-campus as to what kind of my salary minimum was. And they were like, oh yeah, I think we might be able to maybe be able to do that. When they made the offer, they're like, oh, and we can't offer you the salary we talked about. Well, that had nothing to do with me then, right? That was, I told them what I needed. They were hoping to do it. And it wasn't the hiring manager. She really advocated for it, but she was told no. I think if you know what the salary range is and you keep going for it, right? I think it's up to you. Right, there could be room for negotiation. So you might not want to drop out at that stage with the hope that they will come back with more. And if they can't come back with more and you don't accept it, you also don't have to give them a reason as to why you don't accept it, right? People turn down jobs all the time. You don't have to say, well, it's because of the salary. You could just say, you know, I really appreciate the offer, but as I've been thinking about the next move for me, I've decided this is not where I see myself, but I wish you the best of luck in your process, right? You do not owe them any reason as to why you're turning down a position. What else do I see? I've had times where salary isn't discussed until the final stage. Yeah. And I would also say, you know, this is where it's also okay for you to try to ask in the process what the salary range is. You know, if I have done that in jobs before, or with the TPE job that I'm in right now, the person before me was in the office 5 days a week. And I knew at that time I did not want to do that. And so I said in the process, if the expectation is I'm in the office 5 days a week, you know, I don't want to do that commute every day. I'm not going to stay in the search process. And they came back and said, nope, we can work with you. Right. So again, if you can do that in the process, that works as well. Is it reasonable to ask for early retirement investment if returning to a previous employer? Absolutely. And this is another one where schools may or may not be able to, or they may or may not have the flexibility. There are some institutions where you have to be vested for a certain amount of months before you get retirement or something else, right? You can always ask, even if you're not returning to a previous employer. There are some schools where you have to be, in TIA craft for X amount of time before they will contribute as an employer. And you can come in and say, you know what, I'm currently my current employer is contributing, that matters to me. And they might be able to change that. They might not, but that is another good one to ask. If you're returning to a previous employer, oftentimes you will also pick up your sick leave that might still be in the system. If they've paid out for vacation, then that might not, you might not be able to pick it up where you are, but you might be able to go back to your original kind of date of employment so that you can be vested for however many years that is. That's another one to ask about, is when you do leave the position, how do they pay out sick leave and vacation? I am currently, I've been at state schools where the sick leave stays within the system, but they pay out your vacation up to X number of hours, right? But that could add up, right? If you're saving vacation days, that could be a good amount. So you might want to ask about that as well. All right. Other questions? Feel like I've been a little bit all over the place, so I apologize. I think, I just really want to make sure I'm trying to, re-emphasize, like, the best thing you can do is advocate for yourself and ask. The worst that can happen is they say no, but I really don't think they want you for the position. They want you on their team. They want to make it work. As somebody who has hired people for 20 years, I don't want to have to go through the search process again. I want to try to do what I can do to have the candidate that I want in the position be in the position. And there's going to be times that I can't give them what they want, and they might say no, but I'm going to try to make it work. And so put it out there, ask, and then, that gives them again, that kind of place to come back and say, I can't give you that, but here's what I can do for you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fox, for this amazing session about negotiation and really understanding, one, how to negotiate your salary, but to also look at benefits and resources that, if given an offer and if accepted, what could be available to you as an individual. And so for everyone in this session, and for those who are watching asynchronously, we'll be posting this on YouTube, but the learning and conversations don't need to stop here. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us on our platforms, continue on the conversation. And I just want to say thank you all for being in this space, sending much positivity to you all. If you're still in the job search process, or if you're ending your job search process, we are sending you the much love and energy that you deserve. And if you need anything, know that we're here. Thank you and have an amazing start to your week.